Michael Turner had always believed that life settled into predictable rhythms as people got older, and for years he had accepted that belief without questioning it. He woke up early, went to work as a project supervisor, returned home to a quiet house in Oregon, shared polite dinners with his wife Laura, and ended each night watching the same news channel before heading to bed, all while convincing himself that the soft emotional distance in his marriage was simply a natural part of time passing, not something to worry about. But when their only son Ethan, now 23 and fresh out of a painful breakup, moved back home, everything in Michael's carefully constructed world began shifting in subtle, unsettling ways he couldn't ignore. Ethan was usually gentle, polite, and responsible, yet lately he seemed restless, always stepping out of the house earlier than Michael remembered, getting dressed with a sudden attention to detail, wearing cologne he hadn't touched in months, and checking his phone with a nervous anticipation that made Michael pause. At first he dismissed it as a young man trying to rebuild his confidence after heartbreak, but the worry in a father's heart always knows when something is off, even if logic tries to silence it. One chilly autumn morning, while the house was still wrapped in the quiet of dawn, Michael saw Ethan slipping out the front door wearing a pressed shirt, styled hair, and an expression too serious for a simple coffee run. Curiosity tugged at Michael, but he held back, reminding himself that everyone, especially young adults, needed room to breathe and make their own choices. Still, the feeling didn't fade, and it grew even heavier 3 days later when Michael, trying to help Ethan with a software update on his laptop, unintentionally caught a glimpse of a message that flashed on the screen for less than a second, a message simple in words but heavy in meaning. "I'll see you again tonight." "I shouldn't, but I can't resist." Michael froze with his hand still hovering over the keyboard, his heart thudding harder than he expected, because the tone of that message wasn't playful, casual, or professional. It carried the unmistakable energy of a secret someone shouldn't be keeping, especially someone Ethan's age, especially someone who had just gone through emotional pain. Michael stepped back, pretending he hadn't seen anything, but the weight of that message pressed into the back of his mind like a whisper refusing to fade, making him question every recent change in Ethan's behavior. That day, Michael found himself noticing every little detail: Ethan's distracted smile, his glowing phone screen, his sudden need to step outside to take calls, and his vague explanations about meeting a friend, none of which sounded wrong but all of which sounded incomplete. Michael tried to talk himself out of worrying, but the truth was that the message had awakened an old ache inside him, a memory he didn't want to revisit, a quiet loneliness he had buried years ago, the kind that taught him how slippery emotional comfort could be when given by the wrong person. As he sat at dinner that night, listening to Laura talk about her day while Ethan kept glancing at his phone, Michael felt a growing tension he couldn't name. Part of him wanted to ask Ethan directly what was happening, while another part, the cautious part shaped by his own mistakes and regrets, waited, watched, and hoped the situation wasn't as dangerous as it looked. But the real turning point came when Michael walked past the living room window later that evening and saw Ethan pacing outside on the porch, whispering into his phone with a tone that sounded too intimate, too gentle, too emotionally charged to be a simple friendship. Michael felt a strange mix of fear and déjà vu, as if life was circling back to test him with a mirror of his own past choices, the ones he never spoke about, not even to Laura. And as he watched Ethan end the call with a conflicted sigh, Michael felt a deep, unsettling instinct settle into his chest. His son was keeping a secret, and that secret wasn't harmless. Michael didn't know who Ethan was meeting, or why he sounded so emotionally tangled, but he sensed something fragile in the air, something that could easily break if handled the wrong way. And for the first time in years, Michael felt an old fear return, a fear not of losing control, but of watching someone he loved walk toward a mistake that could shape the rest of his life. What Michael didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that the truth waiting for him was far more complicated and far more personal than he could ever expect, a truth that would pull him into a story he thought he had left behind forever. Michael couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled inside him after seeing Ethan's message, and over the next few days the feeling grew stronger, especially as Ethan continued slipping out of the house at the same time every afternoon with a strange mix of nervousness and excitement in his eyes, a look that reminded Michael of someone falling into something they couldn't fully control. Each time Ethan left, Michael felt the same tightening in his chest, as if a warning sign was forming. inside him, and even though he tried to tell himself to respect Ethan's privacy, the father in him couldn't silence the fear that his son was stepping into a situation too emotionally complicated for him to handle. Michael had lived long enough to understand that not every mistake came wrapped in danger. Sometimes mistakes came wrapped in comfort, in longing, in quiet attention that felt harmless at first but quietly pulled a person into deeper waters, and that was the fear troubling him most, not that Ethan was doing something reckless, but that he was growing attached to someone who could hurt him without meaning to. After nearly a week of watching Ethan drift further into secrecy, Michael made a decision he wasn't proud of but felt necessary. He would follow his son, not to judge him but to understand the truth before it was too late. On a cool evening painted with soft autumn colors, he saw Ethan leave again, dressed neatly and wearing a hopeful tension in his shoulders. Michael waited 2 minutes then slipped into his car, keeping enough distance so Ethan wouldn't notice. The drive took them toward the riverfront district, a quiet area filled with small cafes and bookshops, places where people met for private conversations, gentle connections, and moments they didn't want the world to see. Michael felt his stomach tighten as Ethan parked and walked into a cozy cafe with warm yellow lights glowing through the windows. Michael parked across the street, telling himself this was simply observation, not intrusion, but when he saw Ethan walk toward a woman already seated by the window, his breath caught in his chest in a way he hadn't felt in years. The woman looked familiar, too familiar. Her soft brown hair fell over her shoulders the same way he remembered, her calm posture, the thoughtful way she held her coffee cup, the gentle curve of her smile, everything about her hit him with a wave of memory he thought had disappeared long ago. Emily Hartwell. The woman who had once been his co-worker, the woman he had shared quiet lunches and long conversations with, the woman he had developed an emotional closeness with during a painful chapter of his marriage, the woman he had chosen to distance himself from because he knew crossing the line would destroy the life he wanted to protect. And now she was sitting across from his son. The shock washed over Michael in a single, heavy wave. He felt the world tilt, not violently but slowly, like a truth unfolding in front of him that he had never prepared for. Emily looked older now, more mature, more grounded, but still carried that gentle warmth that once made Michael feel understood in ways he couldn't explain. Watching her talk to Ethan, leaning forward with genuine attention, felt like watching two separate parts of his past collide in a way that made no sense. It wasn't just that Emily was married, she had been married back when Michael knew her too. It was the quiet emotional energy between her and Ethan that alarmed him, the soft smiles, the easy laughter, the way Ethan looked at her like she was someone who saw inside him. Michael felt a sting of fear mixed with something he didn't want to admit, guilt from years ago, guilt from the emotional closeness he had once shared with her, guilt that he had never spoken about to anyone, not even to Laura. As he stood there watching, he realized that the connection between Ethan and Emily wasn't accidental. It felt as if the universe had twisted his past into his son's present, tying them together in a way he didn't know how to unravel. He stayed outside for nearly an hour, watching them talk like two people discovering something that made their days brighter, and every minute of it tightened the fear in his chest. This wasn't a simple crush. Ethan looked captivated, hopeful, almost emotionally revived, while Emily looked torn. Her smile was warm, but her eyes carried a flicker of hesitation, as if she knew this was wrong but also couldn't resist the comfort of being seen. When Ethan finally stood up to leave and Emily gently touched his arm while saying goodbye, Michael felt a sudden coldness spread through him. This was not harmless, and it was unfolding much faster than he imagined. As he drove home behind Ethan, he kept replaying the scene in his mind, the soft light of the cafe, the way Ethan leaned in, the way Emily listened with quiet intensity, and each image made him realize that this situation wasn't just risky for Ethan, it was tangled deeply with choices Michael himself had once made. But the most confusing part wasn't the shock of seeing Emily again, it was the realization that Ethan had no idea about Michael's past with her, no idea that the woman he was getting close to was someone who once represented a chapter Michael had tried to close forever. Later that night, as he sat alone in the living room while Laura slept upstairs, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of helplessness, as if life had returned an old wound to him, not to punish him but to force him to face a truth he had never dealt with. He knew he couldn't stay silent anymore, he needed answers, he needed to understand how Ethan met Emily, and he needed to figure out how to protect his son from falling into an emotional storm he didn't see coming. But deep down, beneath the fatherly concern and the fear of the consequences, Michael felt something even more unsettling, a quiet dread that this situation was about to pull him into a story he thought he had escaped years ago, a story that now involved his own son in ways he never imagined. Michael spent the entire night thinking about what he had seen: Ethan sitting with Emily, laughing softly, sharing looks that carried more emotion than simple friendship, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't stay silent. He had already lived through the danger of emotional closeness with a married person, and he knew how easily loneliness could pull someone into choices that felt comforting in the moment but painful in the end. So the next evening, when Ethan came home looking lighter than he had in months, Michael asked him to sit down, not as a strict parent but as someone who loved him deeply and feared what he was walking into. Ethan looked confused at first, then tense, as if he already sensed where the conversation was heading. And before Michael could even start, Ethan sighed quietly and whispered, "Dad, you know, don't you?" Those words confirmed everything Michael had feared. Instead of anger, Michael felt a deep sadness rising inside him, because his son wasn't acting rebellious, he was hurting, searching for a connection that filled the emptiness left behind by his breakup. When Michael gently asked who the woman was, Ethan hesitated, then admitted it was someone older, someone who understood him. Someone who made him feel seen and valued, and though he didn't say her name at first, the emotion in his voice made it clear this wasn't a simple crush, it was something deeper, something that had grown quietly but powerfully. Michael's heart clenched when Ethan finally whispered the name he already knew, Emily, and the room felt suddenly heavier, as if the past had stepped back into Michael's present with full force. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his voice shaking as he explained that he knew she was married and that he wasn't proud of the situation, but he couldn't deny how she made him feel, how talking to her calmed him, how she listened without judging, how she made him feel important at a time when he felt broken. Michael listened without interrupting, remembering the exact feelings Ethan was describing, because years ago, Emily had given him that same sense of warmth and understanding when his marriage was going through its own quiet frost. But hearing those emotions come from his son made Michael's chest tighten with guilt and fear. It wasn't Emily who frightened him most, it was the reflection of his own past in Ethan's eyes. Michael asked how Ethan even met her, and that was when Ethan said something that stunned him more than anything else. Ethan admitted that curiosity had led him down a path Michael never expected. One night, while using the old family computer for a project, Ethan stumbled on archived emails between Michael and Emily. Old messages that weren't inappropriate but carried a softness, a closeness, a warmth that didn't belong between co-workers, and those messages made him wonder who Emily was, why she made his father sound more open than he usually was, and what kind of person could create that kind of emotional pull. Hearing this, Michael felt the past hit him like a weight he had never prepared for. He realized that even though he never crossed the line with Emily, the emotional attachment he once carried had quietly shaped his son's choices years later, as if an echo of Michael's hidden feelings had traveled forward in time and tangled itself into Ethan's present. Ethan continued explaining, saying that when he met Emily by coincidence at a small bookstore weeks earlier, he recognized her name from those emails, and when they began talking, he felt an instant connection, something he couldn't fully explain, something comforting, as if she understood parts of him he couldn't share with anyone else. Michael felt torn between sympathy and fear. He understood emotional temptation better than he ever wanted to, and he knew that even innocent closeness could become dangerous when someone was vulnerable, lonely, or seeking comfort. As Ethan spoke, his voice cracked with honesty, saying he didn't mean for this to happen. He didn't go searching for an affair, he just found someone who made him feel human again, someone who understood his pain, someone who didn't rush or demand anything from him. Michael wanted to reach across and hug his son, but the heaviness of the situation held him still. He finally gathered the strength to tell Ethan that emotional connections with married people could spiral into heartbreak faster than anyone realized, that what felt comforting now could lead to guilt, confusion, and pain for everyone involved. But before he could continue, Ethan asked a question that pierced Michael deeper than anything else. "Dad, did you ever feel something for her too?" The question hung in the air like a quiet storm. Michael took a long breath, feeling his own past rise up inside him, and he admitted the truth gently. Yes, there was a time when he had felt drawn to Emily, not physically, but emotionally, at a moment when his marriage felt distant and he felt unseen, but he had chosen to step back because crossing that line would have destroyed too many lives, including his own. Ethan listened, stunned, and for a moment both father and son sat in a silence filled with the weight of 2 generations of unspoken longing, both understanding how easily an emotional gap could pull someone toward the wrong person. Michael reached for Ethan's shoulder and told him that he wasn't judging him, that he understood the loneliness that drives a person into dangerous comfort, but he reminded him gently that Emily was married, and no matter how strong the connection felt, it was built on something that wasn't safe or fair to anyone involved. Ethan nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes, because hearing his father's truth made him realize he wasn't the first person to fall into this kind of emotional trap, but it didn't make the feelings disappear, and that torn expression broke Michael's heart. The moment was painful, raw, and honest, but necessary. Michael knew the next steps would be even harder, because understanding the problem didn't end the attachment. It only brought the truth into the light. And now Michael carried a new fear. If he didn't act carefully, Ethan could fall deeper, and all 3 lives, his son's, his own, and Emily's, could be pulled into a storm none of them could escape. The past and present had collided, and Michael could feel the next step approaching like a wave building before it crashes, a moment that would decide everything. And he knew he had to confront Emily, not for anger, but for clarity, for boundaries, and for the sake of his son's future. Michael knew the conversation with Ethan was only the beginning, and even though his heart felt heavy and his mind was filled with fear about what might happen next, he understood that the situation wouldn't resolve until he faced Emily directly, not with anger or judgment, but with the honesty their tangled past demanded. So the next afternoon, he drove to the riverfront cafe where he had last seen her with Ethan, rehearsing the conversation in his mind, trying to find the right balance between compassion and firmness, because he didn't want to blame her entirely, nor did he want to paint Ethan as a rebellious kid. He simply wanted clarity, a way forward, a chance to prevent the situation from destroying more lives. When Michael stepped inside the cafe, Emily was already there, sitting by the same window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her posture stiff, as if she knew this moment was inevitable. When she saw him, something soft flickered in her eyes, surprise, sadness, guilt, all mixed into one expression that made Michael realize she, too, was hurting, too caught in a moment that had gotten away from her. She invited him to sit, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy, full of memories they both never talked about, and unspoken feelings that once hovered between them. Finally, Michael broke the silence, explaining gently what he had seen, what Ethan had told him, and how deeply worried he was, not only for his son, but for her marriage, and even for the emotional echoes between them from years ago. Emily lowered her gaze as he spoke, her fingers trembling slightly around her cup, and when she finally answered, her voice was low, humble, and honest. She admitted she never meant for anything to happen, that she met Ethan by accident, that she was surprised by how quickly their conversations became meaningful, and that she had recognized the danger but felt drawn to the comfort of being understood, especially during a time when she felt distant from her own husband, overwhelmed by responsibilities, and forgotten in the quiet routine of her life. She confessed she had been lonely, not in a dramatic or desperate way, but in the slow, creeping way that happens when someone stops feeling seen in their own home, and Ethan's kindness, vulnerability, and gentle attention made her feel alive again, not because she wanted to betray her marriage, but because she had lost a part of herself along the way. Listening to her, Michael felt both sympathy and sadness, because her words echoed the exact emotions he once felt toward her years ago, proving that emotional longing doesn't disappear with age, it only changes shape. But he also knew that understanding didn't excuse the growing attachment, so he gently explained that Ethan was young, vulnerable, and still healing from heartbreak, and that even though he admired the connection they shared, it wasn't fair for either of them to continue down a path that could only lead to pain. Emily nodded, tears forming quietly in her eyes, and she admitted that she had already realized this in the last few days, that every smile from Ethan made her feel both warm and guilty, and that she had been searching for the strength to end it, because even though the conversations made her feel valued, she knew this wasn't a future she could choose, not for herself, not for her husband, and certainly not for Ethan. She looked at Michael with a pained honesty and said something that pierced him deeply. I wasn't falling in love with Ethan. I was remembering the version of myself I used to be when I first met you. Those words hit Michael like a quiet shock, not because they rekindled old feelings, but because they revealed how heavily the past had shaped the present, how two people carrying old emotional scars had unconsciously passed those scars to Ethan without meaning to. Michael assured her he didn't hold anger toward her, that he understood emotional accidents far better than most people, but he also made it clear that the situation had to end, kindly, respectfully, honestly. Emily agreed immediately, promising she would talk to Ethan and set a firm boundary, not with coldness but with sincerity, offering him closure instead of confusion. After leaving the cafe, Michael felt exhausted but at peace, knowing he had done the right thing. However, the hardest part still remained, helping Ethan accept a goodbye he wasn't prepared for. When Ethan returned home later that night, looking hopeful and nervous, Michael sat beside him and explained gently that he had spoken to Emily, that she cared about him, that she valued the connection they shared, but that she knew continuing would only cause deeper heartbreak. Ethan didn't speak at first, he just stared at the floor, absorbing the words, and slowly, his expression changed from confusion to hurt, then to quiet acceptance, as if he knew deep down this moment would come eventually. He asked if Emily said anything specific, and Michael repeated her words honestly, that she admired the kindness and understanding Ethan showed her, that he helped her feel seen during a difficult time, but that she couldn't continue crossing emotional boundaries that didn't belong to her. Ethan's eyes watered, but he didn't cry. Instead, he whispered that he never wanted to ruin anyone's life, that he didn't mean to fall for someone who wasn't his to love, and that he felt foolish for letting his heart lead him into something impossible. Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder and told him he wasn't foolish, he was human, and sometimes life pulls people toward comfort instead of logic, especially when they're hurting. Over the next few weeks, Ethan slowly healed. He focused on work, spent more time with friends, went on long runs by the river, and gradually let the attachment fade into memory, while Michael used the experience to reflect on his own marriage with Laura, realizing how emotional distance can slowly create empty spaces that others might fill if left unattended. He began spending more time with her, rebuilding small moments, shared morning coffees, evening walks, gentle conversations, that had been missing for too long. Their relationship didn't transform overnight, but they began rediscovering each other in quiet, meaningful ways. Emily stepped away quietly, sending Ethan a final message of closure, kind, respectful, clear, and then removed herself from the emotional triangle completely, choosing to rebuild her own marriage and step back into the life she had nearly drifted away from. In the end, Michael realized something profound: sometimes the most dangerous affairs aren't physical, they are emotional, subtle, and unintentional, born from loneliness rather than desire, and sometimes the greatest wounds come not from betrayal, but from longing. As he and Ethan sat on the porch one evening months later, watching the sunset burn softly across the sky, Michael felt grateful that the past had not repeated itself, that he had been able to help his son step away from a moment that could have changed his life forever, and that both of them had learned a lesson that would shape their future relationships with greater honesty, caution, and emotional strength. And though none of them would forget what happened, they all came out wiser, gentler, and more aware of how fragile the human heart can be, and how important it is to guard it with care.